Global inflation is rising. It has been rising for years and it isn't going to get any lower anytime soon. And what most people don't know is that actually this isn't an accident. Globalists and neoliberals out there are actively pushing our economies towards high inflationary environments for ideological reasons. And in this video, I'm going to explain why they're doing this, how they're doing this, and how it's going to make the average person in every Western nation around the world poorer. Now, this all starts with basically a growing government. The government's spending, our government, my UK government, the American government, every government in the world, they have increased their spending compared to the size of their economy for decades on end at this point. And that's been for a number of different reasons. There have been expansions of services into new areas like free at the point of use healthcare. We've had the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK for almost 100 years now, but the US didn't used to have government free at the point of use healthcare, and now it does, just like European countries and others. There have been other expansions of services like pensions. No major country had substantial state pensions 100 years ago, and for 99% of human civilization, state pensions have not existed, and they probably won't exist in 100 years either. We've seen green and carbon cutting initiatives come into play where, again, no major country in the entire world spent money trying to be green 40 years ago. They just focused on being cheap and efficient, and then this Western collective guilt and media manipulation and these neoliberals and globalists, they enabled governments to target green initiatives, and this costs money to build these initiatives, but to run them going forward as well, as at the end of the day, markets find the most efficient resources, most efficient energy systems and vehicles and everything like that. And so paying extra money to wind turbine manufacturers just because they're green costs money. The government giving subsidies to electric vehicles costs money. These useless carbon capture schemes are literally just spending money with no asset at the end of it. We've seen welfare or job seekers or sick pay or benefits, whatever you want to call it, grow in expansion of services massively. In the UK, we've had Motability. In the UK, you can get free money, of course, if you're unemployed or if you're ill, but you can also get some free rent on top of that free money as well. And now you can get a free car as well for some of the most ridiculous reasons in the world. Take a look at this here. 9,000 people in the UK have gotten a free car from the government because they have ADHD. 770 people have gotten a free car because they're alcoholics. 32,000 people have gotten a free car because they have anxiety or depression. 7,000 for back pain. 7,500 for just another form of depression. 50 people have free cars in the UK because they have elbow disorders. But it isn't just the expansion of new services, it's the expansion of old services as well. And something like Medicare or Medicaid is a great example of this too. This here is spending in the United States on Medicare over the last few decades. And what I want you to take note of is this is not a linear graph. It goes up in 5-year increments here until we get to 2010, and then it goes up in 1-year increments. And the spending is absolutely out of control. $1.1 trillion spent on Medicare over the last year, whereas just 15 years ago, it was literally less than half of that. We have the expansion of the NHS and its spending in the UK. Here's a graph indexed against 2013. We are spending 45% more than we used to 10 years ago on our healthcare in the UK. And then alongside all of this comes, why are we spending so much on this? Well, there is a massive inefficiency of government services, and this little graph from The Economist here is one of my favorite that I always love to fall back on because it's indexed productivity in the United Kingdom's public sector versus our private sector over the last 2, almost 3 decades now at this point. As you can see, public sector productivity, which is really just how much wealth is created by each person in the public, and the public sector in the UK is basically just government stuff, has risen by 5% over the last 28 years. 28 years, and efficiency in the public sector has risen by 5%. In the private sector, it's risen by almost 40%. And the funniest thing about this is when COVID came, the public sector shut down and lost efficiency, whereas the private sector hopped onto innovations and started working from home and got more efficient. Now, these two scenarios here have the exact same technological advancements, the exact same country, the exact same people, the exact same institutions, the exact same transport and housing and everything else. Yet one side has had a 4% increase in productivity over the last 28 years, the other side has had a 40. That is a monumental difference, and it's the same across countless countries around the world. This here is a graph of spending, government spending in proportion to GDP. We see massive spikes, of course, around the First World War, the Second World War, but then just a very, very steady rise upwards. France is speed running towards economic collapse here, with an increasingly weak private sector holding up that public sector, but the United States is here as well, increasing that percentage. Japan's going up, the United Kingdom's going up, and it's the same across the world. Canada, Australia, it's all the same. Now, greater public spending, greater government is bad for the country and the people. The politicians push for it because they want that control and that power, and they like to buy votes through free stuff, and they like to gain greater influence over their ideological goals. Tax rises, though, are inherently unpopular, right? They're visible and they're understandable to everyone, and when there is a tax rise, it's in the news and people can't ignore it. You're literally taking money out of people's pockets, and so it has to be done in a very targeted way, basically driving division between rich and poor and trying to get the poor to vote for tax rises for the rich. But inflation is basically a stealth tax. Why would you bother taking a very, very detailed political hit instantly the second you raise taxes when you can just inflate away that debt a little bit instead? At a consistent 3 to 4% inflation, the debt burden that our countries is facing will drop massively. But what we see is that wealth is being taken from current holders of currency, of the dollars, of the pounds, of the euros in the world, and then it's being put into the hands of the government instead. So you're taking money from the people, you're giving it to the government. It is plain and simply a tax. Now, frankly, the reason we're seeing such sustained levels of high inflation all around the world and why it's going to continue to happen is that actually the only way to pay for this massive expansion of the state is through inflation, and so we will see inflation. Now, there's a lovely quote that I really, really like here from a scientist in systems thinking, which is, "The purpose of a system is what it does." There is no point in claiming that the purpose of a system is what it constantly fails to do. Central banks and governments have, over the last 5 years now, enacted policies that consistently created inflation higher than 2% for years. It cannot be an accident if it is sustained. And if it is sustained now, it will continue to be sustained going forward. And the purpose of the systems that these people have put into place is to cause high inflation, because that is what it is doing. Now, the reason this is such an urgent problem is because the debt burden on all of our countries is rising beyond control. Yields on government debt are just going up all around the West, from bonds from 1 years long to 30 years. Here we have the US 1-year Treasury yield. Obviously, it's at its highest points over here in 2023, but it's still far higher than the last 10-year trend. We go on over to the 10-year yield, and again, we see the exact same thing, close to all-time highs at 4.2%. We go to the 30-year yield, and we actually are at highs over the last couple of decades, touching on 5%. What about the UK then? Well, it's the exact same situation. Here's our 1-year gilt yields over the last 10 years. Very, very high. Here are our 10-year bond yields, gilt yields, over the last 10 years at all-time highs of 4.7%. Here's our 30 years at even more insane all-time highs at 5.6%. So why are yields on government debt rising all around the world? Because this isn't just the United States and the United Kingdom. It's Europe as well. It's Australia. It's Canada. It's Japan. Why are yields on debt rising? Well, the first reason is that there's a lack of private sector growth, and that's leading to an inefficient economy, right? Government jobs very often provide literally zero value. They are just jobs for the sake of jobs. Firefighters, they are out there providing value, economic value as well as, moral value as well. They stop fires, they save assets, they save lives, the economy grows. Police provide value. They stop crime, they promote safety, they promote stability, the economy grows. Paper pushers and bureaucrats provide no value. They don't build anything, they don't make anything, they take money away from productive people, and investors are seeing a shift towards inefficiency in the West, and they're expecting turbulent times for governments as a result of that. Now, the second reason is that there's a lack of faith in the government to fix all of these issues. Politics has become transactional with little, if any, improvements at all. You vote for me and I'll give you stuff. Politicians, they just refuse to work for solutions because it doesn't actually help their careers or their re-elections as much as just bribing people with the expansion of the state. And that's led to a situation where problems literally can't be fixed. In the UK, we had a recent example where the Labour government actually tried to reduce spending. They wanted to cut benefits, but the own MPs within their own party, the government, destroyed the bill. They threatened to tear down the government. The Prime Minister had no choice but to give in and stop those cuts. And so even if a government wants to try and fix things and they want to tame in this inefficient sector of the economy, they often can't. And investors know that's how it is, so they know things are going to get worse, and they want a higher premium for lending money to them. And then the third reason that gilt yields and bond yields and treasury yields are so high and they're remaining high is that inflation expectations are remaining high too. Inflation expectations play a large part in bond yields as well, because over the time of you holding a bond, the value of that currency is going to decrease, which means the returns of the bonds are going down too. And then when you actually get that bond returned in full, the principal at the end of its duration, well, that's worth less as well. So when you expect high inflation, you demand higher yields to make up for it. And it's now almost certain that we are going to see inflation higher than 2% in almost every Western country for years going forward at this point. But that's also politically dangerous. And so the next thing the globalists and the neoliberals who are running things are trying to do is they're trying to encourage the people that high inflation is actually a good thing and that we need a change of our inflation target from 2% to 3%. This here is a left-wing newspaper called Le Monde, very infamous. They are pushing for economists to reconsider the 2% inflation, hiding under the guise of this is just what economists think should be done. Here we have Apollo's chief economist seeing a change coming to the US Federal Reserve's inflation target, and he also said that regardless of what the official target is, behind the scenes it's likely that the target is already higher than 2%. Again, going back to that idea of the purpose of a system is what it does. They're seeing higher inflation than 2% and they're happy, ergo that is the purpose of what they're trying to see. We have the European Central Bank being lobbied by left-wing think tanks to try and raise inflation for some reason to try and protect the poorest. I don't know how it's going to protect the poorest, but that's what these think tanks are claiming. We have this awful think tank here called Green Central Banking, who say that the inflation target needs to be raised by 3% to protect the climate. How does this protect the climate? They literally don't say, but they say that maybe a flexible policy that can only change for the short term might help. And as we all know with governments, anything temporary is always permanent. Nixon said that removing the gold standard from the dollar was only temporary. Income tax in the United States was supposed to be temporary to pay for the First World War. The reduction of government services from COVID was only supposed to be temporary. And of course, an inflation target of 3%, if governments manage to sway public opinion and manipulate people into thinking this is good for them, that would only be temporary as well, but that temporary would last forever. And then we have manipulation of inflation data so that maybe they don't even need to convince people to change it to 3%. They can just lie about it and say that it's 2% when it isn't already. And we've already seen huge amounts of manipulation of data over the last few decades. In the 1990s, the United States had something called the substitution effect. Basically, steak and beef was getting really expensive. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they just stopped measuring the price of beef and they replaced it with chicken. And their explanation was that beef is so expensive that people don't actually buy it anymore, so it doesn't matter if the price goes up. Instead, we'll measure the price of chicken, which is far lower. So here you go, well done, pat yourself on the backs, inflation is down. We have something called hedonic adjustments in the US CPI features as well. If you buy a TV last year without a certain feature for $1,000, and then you buy a TV this year with a new feature for $1,100, well, according to hedonic adjustments, the price of that TV may have actually gone down because the new feature needs to be baked into the price. And so what we see is the government forces new cars, for instance, to have reversing cameras and side impact airbags and lane assist and anti-lock brakes and all sorts of features. And then the government can use those new features to claim that you're actually getting more car than before. So prices aren't actually rising, you're just imagining things, and they can say with supposed integrity that inflation is actually down. We have owner's equivalent rent in the United States as well. How does the United States government work out increases in rental prices? Do they use algorithms or massive data points? Do they use private companies who are very efficient numbers on this like Zillow? No. They ask people who own their own homes and live in them, who don't rent and aren't landlords, what the rent would be if they rented it out. They literally survey owner-occupiers and say, if you rented out your house today, what would the price be? And that is how they get the inflation data for rents across the United States. Now, homeowners don't rent and they don't rent their homes out, so they don't know what the price would be. And what we see is a consistent, sustained, always underestimate of the real numbers. The methods that governments use to manipulate inflation data are literally countless, all over the place. In the United Kingdom, the CPI figure does not include any costs borne by people living in a house that they own. They have a separate figure called CPIH, CPI housing, for that, which of course isn't the headline figure and the media ignores and the government pretends doesn't exist. Right now, inflation in the UK, according to the government, is 3.8%. But 64% of people in the United Kingdom live in a home that they own. Yet the costs of all of that, home insurance, or if you need a roof repairing, or if your boiler breaks down, none of the costs of that are borne into that CPI number. Instead, that's under CPIH, where the inflation number is 4.2%. So genuinely, the number of ways that governments are already manipulating inflation data to lie to you about how they're stealing your money is countless. And inflation is that stealth tax as well. It changes who owns the wealth. It takes wealth away from those of us who use or need or save that currency, and it gives wealth to those who print the currency, which is always the government. It is the government taking wealth away from its citizens, just like a tax. And on top of that, it's regressive as well. Who loses with high inflation? Well, people who rely on an income. And you might say, who the hell doesn't rely on an income? Well, either the mega wealthy who own huge amounts of assets and live off the returns from them, or bureaucrats and politicians who just sign a new law to increase their income higher than inflation. Real working people, well, their income rises slower than inflation. They make less money each year, not more, in real terms. The second people who lose with high inflation, well, those who spend a large proportion of their income or their wealth every year. Those who have to spend all they earn. Their rent is too high. They have to pay for a car, buy food for their family. They have no opportunity to invest in the assets which grow with inflation, and so they get poorer when there is inflation. And then there's people who save a large proportion of their income or their wealth. If you earn less than $100,000 a year, you need an emergency fund in cash to cover, say, 6 months of your living expenses in case you lose your job. If you don't, then if you lose your job, you might go bankrupt and lose your house and your car. You can't afford to invest all your money in case the markets go down when you need that cash. So we find that you hold lots of cash in comparison to your earnings or your wealth, and you lose out from inflation. Who wins from inflation? Well, first of all, the people who control the government, obviously, because they dictate their own circumstances. Inflation increases the size of the departments, of the number of promotions, of the salary from their work. They directly benefit from a richer government because these people literally are the government. Then there's those who have lots of assets. Inflation affects assets as well. Assets get inflated too. Stocks get more expensive to own and return lower dividends, but the wealth of those shareholders increases. Property and real estate prices go up in value, and the owners end up better off. Businesses charge higher prices. They increase their revenue. They increase their profits. They increase their valuation. They get richer. So inflation makes asset owners richer as well. And then we have people who have lots of debt. And we're not talking $20,000 in credit card debt, car loans, or payday loans or something like that. Inflation will never be high enough to outweigh short-term interest rates on consumer debt. I'm talking about maybe a $10 million loan on an apartment building, or a $50 million loan to buy up a new company. Inflation erodes away the value of that debt, and it increases the wealth of those in control. So across the board, when it comes to a high inflationary environment, we see ordinary working people lose out, and we see globalists and neoliberals win, and that's why they're pushing this so heavily. Now, who is pushing for higher inflation? Well, we already know, don't we? It's people like this, Green Central Banking, a think tank which sounds absolutely horrific, pushing for higher inflation. It's Le Monde, a left-wing French newspaper, pushing for higher inflation. It's European Central Bank researchers pushing for higher inflation. It's the former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund pushing for higher inflation. It's a Wall Street Journal employed economist, this guy Joseph Bruxelles, pushing for higher inflation. It's actually CNN pushing for higher inflation, and it's another left-wing paper, The Intercept, pushing for higher inflation. What we need to remember is that the purpose of a system is what it does, not what it claims to want. Globalist think tanks, these researchers, these economists, these newspapers, these neoliberals, they're all pushing for higher inflation. Central banks and globalist leaders have given us higher inflation for years. They will continue to give us higher inflation for years, and this is all by design. It is the purpose of the system they've built. All those globalist figures out there are trying to push more inflation onto you because it reduces your wealth, your independence, and your control, and it increases the power and the authority of those bureaucrats and globalists who are actually in charge.